face the threat, not with dread and confusion, but with confidence and conviction. We hold it to be the first task of statesmanship to develop the strength that will deter the forces of aggression and promote the conditions of peace. My citizens, I thank you.
Dwight Eisenhower assumed the presidency in the months following the detonation of the world's first thermonuclear device at Eniwetok. Throughout the campaign, Eisenhower had promised to re-examine the balance between security and solvency. But the initial concern of the new president and his advisors would be resolving the matter of Korea.
Shortly after Eisenhower took office and had started the process of developing a fabric of security policies and plans, in the Soviet Union, Generalissimo Stalin died.
When he dies, there's an almost immediate change of policy in Moscow, which is discussed with the North Koreans, which says we'll now take a series of steps to try to bring the war to an end.
Both sides agreed to a ceasefire in July 1953. By driving the North Korean forces back out of South Korea, the U.S. had produced the status quo ante, and an uneasy truce prevailed. Eisenhower and his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles vowed there would be no more Koreas.
And both he and Dulles were people who thought you must have a coherent strategy. They decided that they would put a major study of alternative policies toward the Soviet Union for the purpose of hearing a really thought-through alternative possibilities.
They decided on that in the solarium of the White House mansion, so it took the name Solarium as a result of that.
And there were really three approaches that were essentially put forward, each assigned to one team. Task Force A was supposed to consider the prospects of a containment policy. B was called drawing the line, that if they took any measures to expand, they would run the risk of a massive response. And C was given essentially the assignment of defending a policy of rollback, of the idea of trying to force the Soviet Union to capitulate by coercion.
At the end of our work, which went on for 5 weeks, in complete secrecy here in Washington, we met in the library of the White House.
And each of the teams had a time for a full presentation of its case.
At the end of it, Eisenhower jumped up and said, "Now I'd like to summarize and comment on what we've heard." And he spoke for 45 minutes without a note, pulling the whole thing together. In doing so, he showed his intellectual ascendancy over every man in the room.
Eisenhower reaffirmed a policy of containment. The president was under no illusions of what a nuclear war with the Soviets would be. It would be a war of utter devastation.
The Joe 4 explosion in August of 1953 had a major psychological impact on us. The details were secret. So all the American public and most of the members of the Congress and other American leaders knew was the Russians had exploded a hydrogen bomb.
At the National Security Council, the detonation of a Soviet thermonuclear bomb underscored the urgency of preparing a new national security policy.
All of this flows together in the fall of 1953 into a set of decisions which lead to NSC 162/2. He wanted to pay as much attention as possible to how you could take the psychology of nuclear weapons and turn them into making the strategy as deterrent and possible. And also was his reading, I think, of the Soviets as a fairly conservative group of decision makers. He didn't think they wanted war either.
NSC 162/2 emphasized a nuclear response. In the event of hostilities, the United States will consider nuclear weapons to be as available for use as other munitions, a statement, the true intent of which would be debated for decades.
The defense strategy had two purposes. One was to deter the Soviet Union. The other was to reassure the NATO allies. And therefore, they required really a higher degree of certainty in order to be reassured than the Soviets did to be deterred.
In February 1952, the NATO defense ministers met in Lisbon and agreed to commit 96 divisions in a forward defense of Western Europe.
Well, within a year after making that commitment at Lisbon, it became clear that NATO had neither the resources nor the political will to field a force of that size.
Eisenhower would use increasing numbers of both strategic and tactical nuclear weapons to deter the Soviets in Western Europe. In November 1953, he directed Admiral Radford, Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, to implement the New Look, a military strategy that placed heavy reliance upon nuclear weapons for the long haul.
Eisenhower decided that we were spending too much on the Department of Defense and cut back the planned level of expenditures. This was the new look. We, in the judgment of the administration, could not stand up against the hordes of Soviet soldiers that would be sent against the West, and therefore nuclear weapons were a substitute for maintaining massive conventional forces.
Nuclear weapons got at the heart of NATO strategy very quickly from their initial deployment in 1953. Although the exact role, exactly how and when they were going to be used, was often confusing and ambiguous.
NATO intelligence tended to exaggerate the Soviet threat over the years. The prevailing presumption was a worst possible case, to wit, that the Soviet Union would be bending every resource to build up their military forces against the West as rapidly as possible.
And so a lot of our training and plans were geared on that premise. The MC-14/2, massive retaliation, or the tripwire strategy, was basically that should this massive invasion occur, massive nuclear forces would be used. It would be all-out nuclear war. It was all or nothing.
In the notes of a meeting prepared by Colonel Goodpasture, the president's close personal aide, Eisenhower laid out a deterrent nuclear posture that would set in motion a 20-year buildup of nuclear weapons deployed in Western Europe. Goodpasture wrote, he indicated his firm intention to launch a strategic air force immediately in case of alert of actual attack. He stressed that a major war will be an atomic war.
My reading was that if actual attack were made on our forces in Europe or in the United States, the likelihood of escalation to nuclear war was very, very high, and the Soviets knew that.
The root word is terre, which means to frighten with an overwhelming fear. And if you put the prefix DE in front of it, you get to frighten from carrying out acts. It involves emotions as well, of self-preservation, preservation of regimes, preservations of countries.
Deterrence really rests on a strategy of war prevention, not a strategy of war fighting.
The main purpose of the nuclear deterrent is to put an exclamation point on the end of the sentence that says, if you do bad things to us, we will do even worse things to you, so you'd better not do it in the first place. I think where the nuclear weapon made its biggest difference in history was in Europe during the Cold War.
NSC 162/2 had formalized the concept of nuclear deterrence and extended that deterrent to Western Europe. Eisenhower's challenge was to communicate this policy to the Soviets, the NATO allies, and to the American public. Secretary of State Dulles delivered an address to the Council on Foreign Relations in January 1954, publicly announcing the administration's new national security policy that would depend primarily upon a great capacity to retaliate instantly by means and at places of our choosing.
Massive retaliation, the way Dulles and Eisenhower used it, in a way was a suicide pact. It said, if the Russians invade Western Europe, we're going to hit back with everything we have. We're not going to waste a lot of resources on trying to build tank defenses against tanks.
And there's been no other time, I think, the U.S. has ever believed that to an overwhelming conventional capability, its only response was to escalate to the use of nuclear.
The resulting controversy took Dulles and the president by surprise.
People were very skeptical about Dulles's announcement, about basically the credibility of the announcement, that it was just not believable that, if there was going to be some incursion in what was then called French Indochina with communist forces, would the United States would it really be plausible that the United States would use nuclear weapons on its bombers and destroy Moscow? It just seemed such a disproportionate response.
The introduction of nuclear weapons to deal with every possible contingency certainly struck me, and I think a lot of other people, as just being horrendous.
There were several reasons for the criticism, but the most important was that unless the Soviets or the Warsaw Pact launched a massive attack, it did not seem to justify a massive response on our part.
In 1954, William Kaufman was among an emerging group of civilian strategists who argued that the credibility of retaliation was the key element of deterrence.
There was certainly a problem in the NATO community about the probability that the United States would really let loose its nuclear capabilities in the event of a Soviet invasion.
If the U.S. was there, present in case of any attack, it was bound to be involved because its forces were involved.
But it was not a one-sided affair where we could just blow away some targets, which were never specified, and that there'd be no retaliation.
A massive retaliation was not seen by Eisenhower as the panacea for all forms of military conflict. On the contrary, it was addressed primarily to the question of how to prevent or conduct general war if that should be forced upon you.
Eisenhower never really, I think, came seriously close to considering use of nuclear weapons. So he was much more cautious. We had advantages, technology, air power, nuclear weapons, and they were trying to play to our strength. And I think it was fine with him to have in Dulles a pure ideologue, someone who was going to try to scare the hell out of people. That's declaratory policy. Whether it matches employment policy, what you'd actually do is another matter.
Eisenhower, by betting on massive retaliation, made European economic growth continue longer. Fewer young men had to be in the military. We're all richer today because we took that chance in the 1950s of betting on massive retaliation.
In the early 1950s, much of our deterrent force was based forward. The B-47s, which were based in Morocco, some of them were based in Saudi Arabia, and those were felt to be quite vulnerable.
This was a time when, not long after the Soviet Union had exploded its first nuclear weapon. And the question inevitably came up, well, suppose the Soviet Union were to drop a bomb on these bases, on each of these bases, what would happen?
This question was pondered by researchers at the RAND Corporation. Populated by a unique cadre of top U.S. scientific talent, RAND was perhaps the first defense think tank.
was a project with a very broad charter, very broad scope, to look at challenges for aeronautics, space, warfare from an Air Force perspective. There was a lot of talented people, some of whom were working on topics that were very relevant to questions of nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy.
One of those people was Albert Wohlstetter, who, in 1954, issued a top-secret report warning that SAC's overseas bases were vulnerable to a Soviet first strike.
Albert Wohlstetter led a team at the RAND Corporation that looked closely at worst-case possibilities of could the Soviets catch all of our bombers on the ground and win World War III. And he sort of convinced people that this was a real risk unless major reforms were made in the way SAC, Strategic Air Command, was based and stationed.
Eisenhower's conception was that you might knock out some bases, but you would not knock out enough of the capability altogether so that they were not faced with retaliation.
But the message was always that if one of their bombers gets in and gets over our base, it could destroy the whole base of 50 or 100 bombers, and if they did that enough times, they'd win World War III, and if we do that to them, we win World War III. And that's very nerve-wracking.
Air Force people remembering the destruction in the Philippines and at Pearl Harbor always felt that if it was important to get in the first blow, if one was coming to war, don't let the enemy get in the first blow.
There's a very deep military logic that would argue for preemption. It's better to get the enemy's forces before they are launched or get you. That's one aspect of preemption. Another is that if your forces are not survivable, there's also a pressure to preempt.
Curtis LeMay once called it anticipatory retaliation. The notion is that war is imminent, it's unavoidable, and you are simply getting the first blow in to be able to destroy an enemy's forces while they're being armed, while they're being fueled.
LeMay was prompted to propose preemption for the same reasons a number of other thinkers were. And that was the realization, correctly, that the only way to limit damage on the United States in a thermonuclear war is to go first.
The most unstable situation is a situation where either side can win, depending on who strikes first, and where neither side might want a war, but each side says, I'd rather have the war I start than the war they start.
The Soviet Union, having their forces vulnerable, faced a similar dilemma. They would feel, in a major crisis, that if they waited for a full American attack, they might not be able to retaliate.
Bomber crews racing out to take off was very exciting to watch. Makes great cinema. Very bad for the world political stability. And that makes everybody tense, makes everybody in the mood to strike first when in doubt, and it's what we typically would call very low crisis stability or strategic stability.
Soon, RAND would issue a new staff report, anticipating a Soviet first strike with thermonuclear weapons against the SAC bomber force based in the U.S. One proposed solution was to develop the capacity to retaliate after absorbing a full nuclear attack by the Soviets.
The concept of the Second Strike Force was indeed developed at RAND, but it was something that was inherent in the administration once the vulnerabilities of our force became clear.
In April 1954, Eisenhower asked James Killian of MIT to direct a study of how science and technology could address the nation's vulnerabilities.
The Killian report was very important, particularly for the matter of assuring the survivability and the effectiveness of the nuclear deterrent. First, we must develop missiles as rapidly as possible. The ICBM would be much less vulnerable than it was an airfield and a bomber.
A hypothetical Soviet strike at our bases led to an acceleration of the development of our missile programs, both the Minuteman and the Polaris program.
And then came the development to put weapons at sea in the black oceans where they could not be found and attacked.
The Air Force's dominance of strategic delivery had sidelined the Navy in the late 1940s, but had not left it idle.
A new naval era dawns with the launching of the Nautilus, one of the largest submarines ever built.
The world's first nuclear-powered submarine was launched in January 1954. The Nautilus was significant not only for its naval engineering, but also for the relentless efforts of Admiral Hyman Rickover to establish a nuclear navy. The capability to remain submerged for weeks and months at a time was essential to creating a survivable second strike platform for nuclear weapons. Now the challenge was to launch a missile.
The Navy Polaris program started out with the idea of mounting liquid-fueled missiles of a very large size on the outside of submarine, which is, of course, kind of an abomination to sailors.
This was sort of a shotgun wedding between the Navy and the Army. The Army had the missile, the IRBM Jupiter, and the Navy was given the job of taking that missile, adapting it, and taking it to sea.
At both laboratories, work proceeded on the development of lighter and smaller thermonuclear warheads, specifically with missile delivery in mind. And Livermore decided to see what was the smallest two-stage weapon we felt we could design there in the early 50s.
After a couple of false starts, we at Livermore began to work on ways to reduce the weight of thermonuclear weapons to the point where they could go into modest-sized missiles.
We came up with an idea which I then presented to the Atomic Energy Commission. We can get a megaton in 600 pounds. Now, that was an exaggeration, but we were serious about it.
And that was a huge change. And since the payload weight pretty much drives the size of a missile that's going to carry it, that offered the prospects that we could have a small missile, hopefully solid propelled, that could fit into a submarine hull.
The Polaris submarine was developed in 1960, ahead of schedule. That doesn't happen too often in the development of military weapons. And I've often said Admiral Rayburn deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for getting it out there when he did, because it took an awful lot of attention, an awful lot of the anxiety out of the nuclear confrontation.
With Polaris, the president was free to make a deliberate decision. If in the event of an assault, he could wait and make certain that exactly what was needed and when.
A ballistic missile submarine changed strategic policy because it became, in the early days, the embodiment of the notion of counter value rather than counter force.
Definitely, those missiles were counter-value missiles. Somebody once asked Admiral Rayburn whether a missile fired from the ocean would be accurate enough. And his answer was, if it even hits dry land, it's accurate enough. And what he really meant was, I'm not aiming at a military target, I'm not pretending to be accurate, I'm just imposing damage on the other side, and they know that in advance, and then the war will never happen in the first place.
If you are going to shoot in retaliation at cities, you place a great premium on getting some kind of communication through, but basically you need a very simple message: shoot, don't shoot. And you don't much care how long it takes to get there because you're going to survive.
Key to the viability of Polaris as a deterrent force were improvements in command, control, and communications. Developments in very low-frequency radio technology would provide secure and constant at-sea communication. By 1960, it was clear that Polaris would represent a robust and survivable second-strike retaliatory force.
The advent of the strategic submarine certainly brought a new dimension to survivability and clearly has enabled us to have a significant portion of our strategic submarine force at sea in a relatively relaxed posture, but in a survivable posture. And that survivability really enables you to essentially always be able to strike second. And that's really what deterrence is about. It's that responsive capability, not to strike first, but to be able to always strike second.
Arcane debates about strategic vulnerabilities, preserving crisis stability, and survivable nuclear weapons systems like Polaris remained top secret and well out of public view in 1955.
It's Operation Alert 1955.
What stirred the public's imagination was the fear of thermonuclear attack by Soviet bombers.
The intelligence community had the hypothesis that they would build as rapidly as possible. And it was this presupposition of maximum potential output that led to notions about the Balma Gap.
Returning from the Moscow Air Show in July 1955, Air Force Chief of Staff General Nathan Twining reported seeing scores of new Soviet Bison intercontinental bombers. By 1956, Air Force intelligence, using the presupposition of maximum potential output, predicted that within 5 years, the Soviets could have as many as 800 bombers.
Whole cities could be destroyed by bombs delivered by airplanes. What do? Well, you try to make an air defense. You look to the production of more nuclear weapons, improved nuclear weapons.
I think what's notable is that it was a natural inclination at that time to defend the entire country.
One of the earliest defenses to protect U.S. cities was Nike Ajax, a surface-to-air guided missile system equipped with a conventional high-explosive warhead. By 1958, the Nike Hercules system married a more accurate missile with a nuclear warhead.
We had Nike locations all around the country, very extensive defense systems against aircraft. And so everybody, as a natural instinct, was in favor of defending themselves. When the civil defense program started, that was a natural inclination as well.
The emphasis was essentially on individual citizen action, individual preparation. Civil defense is a component of the doctrine of massive retaliation. On the one hand, we're signaling to the Russians, if you attack us, we will be prepared. We are taking steps to prepare and defend our people. On the other hand, if you attack us, you will experience utter destruction. We will respond massively.
With the White House in the background, Washington is one of scores of cities in the nation's greatest air raid drill.
Throughout the mid-1950s, the nation, together with the president and top government officials, participated in Operation Alert. This nationwide civil defense drill included a top-secret command center in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia.
And there were broadcast facilities there where the president could address the people. And so the idea was continuity of government in the event of the destruction of Washington.
We are here to determine whether or not the government is prepared in time of emergency to continue the functions of government. So there shall be no interruption in the business that must be carried on.
But even as Eisenhower practiced with the nation, he understood that civil defenses and anti-aircraft defenses were no match in a war with thermonuclear weapons. The Atomic Energy Commission began testing deliverable multi-megaton thermonuclear weapons in February 1954. The Bravo test series served to galvanize public attention.
The yield was almost 3 times the most probable value. Unfortunately, the effects of shrimp were felt beyond our proving ground. The fallout was to the east and relatively heavy for several hundred miles.
The radioactive fallout from those tests was much greater than the scientists had anticipated. With the Bravo test, the issue of radioactive fallout really gripped the public mind.
Eisenhower gave deep thought to the thermonuclear weapon. He began to see it as something going beyond anything that had been experienced in traditional warfare.
I think in the period from the mid-50s through the early 60s, you see a process of gradually increasing public apprehension and awareness.
Eisenhower had a grand conundrum that he was working. How do you talk about national security, and in particular, how do you talk about nuclear weapons issues with the American public, where on the one hand, you're not scaring them to death and saying that everything is so desperate that it's impossible, but on the other hand, you're not sugarcoating it or just not talking about it.
The great chore you have here is to give people the facts, show them what they can do, get the federal leadership, get the participation of the states and the municipalities without terrifying people, right?
Through his administration, I think he tried to find that right balance.
We had three main instruments for our security: diplomacy, deterrence, and actual defense, actual military operations.
Eisenhower grappled with conflicting intelligence estimates about a bomber gap, a public aroused to the dangers of thermonuclear weapons, and a defense community urging him to spend billions more. His promise of security with solvency led to a reliance upon nuclear weapons for national security. But at the UN, Eisenhower also initiated a diplomatic track to address widespread fears of thermonuclear war.
The United States pledges before you, and therefore before the world, its determination to help solve the fearful atomic dilemma.
The Atoms for Peace speech was a step toward attempting to control nuclear technology in a way that it could be used peacefully. I think it was a very good speech and an important initiative, but had little to do with arms control. The Eisenhower administration did not really come to grips with arms control as a policy and a concept until the moratorium, the 1958 nuclear test moratorium. And that was just the beginning, but that was, as I see it anyway, the beginning.
As he worked to assuage public fears about thermonuclear warfare with a new generation of weapons and delivery systems, Eisenhower was about to receive a most unwelcome surprise.
Great observatories, radar devices, telescopes, binoculars, and the naked eye scan the skies. In Russian, the word for satellite is Sputnik, and Sputnik has the voluntary moon watchers working overtime.
The launch of Sputnik atop a Soviet SS-6 ICBM set in motion a series of political and technological forces that would challenge Eisenhower's policy of massive retaliation.
The importance of this feat cannot be underestimated. It brings mankind closer and closer to an actual escape into space.
But it will be some time before either we or the Soviet forces will have long-range missile capacity equal to even a small fraction of the total destructive power of our present bomber force.
President Eisenhower went on television and he explained that this was a tremendous accomplishment of the Soviet system. It showed that they could launch missiles, of course, but it didn't change our basic deterrence.
Eisenhower continued to think that the nuclear confrontation was governing. The damage that would come from that was so apparent and so great that the Soviets were not likely to initiate such a conflict.
Not for 1 minute did Khrushchev want a nuclear war. I think he was perfectly clear that this would be, just devastating. That's what his own scientists were telling him. And I think he thought that Eisenhower believed exactly the same thing. What he thought was going on was a war of nerves.
On the heels of Sputnik, came a new report to the president warning of a precipitous Soviet technological advantage, an ICBM capability that could threaten a first strike as early as 1959.
People who had dire views of national security said, of course, the Soviets are ahead. They did a better job with the German engineers. They have more missiles than we. There is a missile gap.
But he said, they haven't told me a thing I haven't been staying awake nights thinking about for these many years.
2 years earlier, the Killian Report had recommended the acceleration of United States missile programs. It also made another equally important proposal, the improvement of U.S. intelligence gathering. This spurred the development of a high-altitude spy plane to monitor Soviet missile deployment.
The U-2 enabled Eisenhower to check areas where they might be producing these weapons and to ensure himself that, in fact, they were not in a position yet to manufacture them.
Yet even with the benefit of new intelligence, an improved early warning system, and the promise of survivable retaliatory systems on the horizon, many felt that Eisenhower's policy of massive retaliation was losing credibility.
The rapid development of the H-bomb caused a number of American strategists, particularly at RAND, to recognize that this was going to be a two-sided game. Ultimately,
it was very uncertain, but you could certainly try to limit those kinds of operations by dealing only with targets that were military targets.
The counterforce arose because a counterforce arose in Russia, so you wanted to try to do something about that. So it became natural to try to target the emerging Soviet nuclear capability.
Nobody could guarantee that if you did counterforce and not counter-city, that it would work out. But it was worth a chance.
There is a dividing line of people in the nuclear age, because some believe that nuclear weapons don't fit this, that nuclear weapons only will produce such massive, horrific destruction that no political objective could be achieved by actually using nuclear weapons. Others believe that they could be if they were used in a calibrated fashion, if they were low yield, if they were proportionate to the aggression.
Eisenhower continued to embrace a policy of deterrence by threatening to inflict unacceptable damage upon the Soviets. A new strategic concept proposed to the president at the National Security Council argued for greater flexibility. But Eisenhower regarded the strategy of graduated retaliation coercion as something akin to fighting with nuclear weapons.
But Eisenhower would have none of it. He was adamantly opposed to the idea of incremental engagement.
Certainly, I think that as an experienced commander from World War II, Eisenhower had little truck with that. The fog of war would just wipe away the nature of the signals you were sending.
All of us know that, whether started deliberately or accidentally, global war would leave civilization in a shambles. This is as true of the Soviet system as of all others. In a nuclear war, there can be no victors, only losers.